I would like to, in fact, start with by saying that if you talk anything about Sanskrit, then it is immediately branded as the saffron agenda, saffronizing the society, or that you are communalizing the society. Probably this may be a political spectrum to that. But at the same time, one has to understand the larger relevance of Sanskrit. Sanskrit basically is very important for us in many ways. And if you see that we talk about Sanskrit or talk about anything which is very ancient in the current times, I think people have some level of discomfort. So I think this beginning of this type of celebration, especially in a very formal, structured manner, in the current context, I think is a good initiative. So let us welcome this initiative. And what is interesting is that people who make lot of these type of observations and hold on. So I think this beginning today, and I'm very delighted that the theme which has been chosen rightly, in fact, is a very perfect theme to understand the relevance of Sanskrit, also understand its legacy in the and how it was used in the past. As you know, when Kautilya wrote Arthashastra, it was written in Sanskrit, and you can imagine the type of challenges which all these translators may be having now in terms of inferring, in terms of knowing what Kautilya had thought of the statecraft of diplomacy, because that perhaps gives you a very holistic understanding. This was perhaps the first Indian treatise on politics, economics, as well as military strategy. So all these three were combined in Kautilya's thinking, which obviously all of us as a student of geopolitics obviously have been going back and trying to understand what he had to offer and how much we can extrapolate from that work now. But at the same time, I think at the larger level, we, I think, have somehow lost somewhere in terms of correlating Kautilya's in understanding the contemporary Indian foreign policy decision-making system. It is a high time that we get back to the basics, try to understand that what is it that can be extrapolated, what is it that can be inferred, and how much Kautilya's Arsas finds a relevance in contemporary Indian foreign policy as well as contemporary world order. I think he was very categorical in terms of telling the king that how to really reign over a kingdom. And also, whenever it is needed, how to encourage direct action in addressing political concerns without regard for ethical considerations. So you should take India-China standoff in the current context and try to use this statement, which I said now. I think we really are completely getting swayed by obviously many other considerations geopolitically, but at the same time, we need to be very realistic in demonstrating our will, reflecting our concerns, addressing to the issues in a manner which could create an environment to promote India's national interest. And the way things are unfolding, I think it's high time that we have to learn from Kautilya Arsas. Anyway, I'm not going to speak much on Kautilya's work. We have a better person than me because Dr. Nandakishore has been working on this for years, I know, and he is going to speak on various aspects of Kautilya Arsas and also tell us, maybe he might use some of these Sanskrit words. So we have to learn from him all those Sanskrit words which really have had been used at that given point in time, and very appropriately how basically that can be learned in the current context in understanding the evolving India, rising India, and also the larger decision-making process, both during the crisis time as well as during peace time. So thank you very much for joining this particular celebration. And obviously, in fact, at the end of this meeting, I would like to address separately on various issues because we are starting our classes from 10th August. On that also, you will be receiving a mail shortly. But I would like to discuss after this whole celebration is over. Now over to Dr. Dhanasri.
Yeah, thank you, sir, for those introductory remarks. And that really opens up a host of issues that we need to discuss today and hereafter as well. It should not end here, the discussion that we are having. So I would like to now, without any delay, invite Dr. Nandkishore, Associate Professor at this Department of Geopolitics and International Relations, to deliver his lecture on the topic Sanskrit Legacy and India's Strategic Thought, a case of Kautilya's Arthashastra. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Dhanashree, and thank you, Professor Arvind, also for a very subtle introduction to Kautilya's Arthashastra, which is exemplary at this juncture to be read across the world. What I try doing is I'll introduce partially some portions of it, a bit of understanding of what exactly Kautilya's Arthashastra was for, and also the time that he wrote, and there is a context that is associated. When there are so many other Dharma Shastras being written, there are also other Arthashastras that are available. Then there are also numerous ones, nitis, different nitis that are available. Yet this one work somehow stands out to be one of the most interesting ones, and it has it has been through a lot of issues, but at the same time it is also one of the most revered text in the Indian context and all over the world. A lot of scholars have been working on this for years together now. At the same time, as Professor Arvind was mentioning, there is some issue here that I need to probably in the beginning itself put it across. Not everything that's written in Sanskrit is sacrosanct. At the same time, not everything that's been put across just because it is in Sanskrit, it needs to be revered as also. Because there was a point of time when Sanskrit was a normal language which people used, and that is how most of the works came out. And some stood extraordinary in that one. And Kautilya essentially falls into that line. Something special about Kautilya is also he is a dialogic subject. When I say dialogic subject, it simply means that as an individual, he agreed upon a lot of works that were done before him, the different type of Arthashastras that had come in before him. There are not less than 24 works that he himself mentions throughout Arthashastra. He gives his reverence to all those people, and then what he does is, throughout the text in one or the other form, he engages with their work. He says, so and so talks about this particular component of statecraft, or this particular component of war, or this component of the Prakriti or the nature that I don't agree with, because their view is like this, but my view is something else. This is what I call as the dialogic subject. That I think it's a beauty of the Indian civilization. Whether you look at Mahabharata, whether you look at Gita, whether you look at any of the Indian texts, most of them are written in the form of a dialogue. There is somebody who's asking a question, somebody is answering it. That's why it is called Upanishad. Even if you look at the Upanishad, that is essentially meaning that there is some sort of a dialogue. In fact, Gandhi also utilized the same thing in the later stages, where he himself would behave like somebody who's questioning, and then he would answer in his Hind Swaraj. Now, saying many of these things is important because it sets a context to what we are talking about. Okay, not every part of Kautilya is useful. There are limitations too, depending on time and many other things, because we have seen over a period of time, most of the works that have been written in the history are junk. They are not even useful these days. But at the same time, this individual has written so much in which we can take something like taxation. Even today, if the same taxation is utilized with a bit of modification, perhaps that's going to be one of the best. I think Dr. Swami has been one of the persons who's been extremely vocal on this. And he says somehow we are not able to learn. We still want things to come from elsewhere. Okay, now having said that, let me just take you people through a bit of what Kautilya is all about. A few places where he mentioned certain things where he was much more open compared to his contemporaries, compared to a lot of other people who wrote at that particular point of time. Kautilya, in the beginning itself, in the Arthashastra, in the first chapter itself, he makes an introduction where in the 19th verse he talks about, he brings upon and he says, Praja Sukhe Sukam Rajaha, Prajanancha Hite Hitam, Natmama Priyam Hitam Rajaha, Prajanantu Priyam Hitam. He says simply, In the happiness of his subjects lies the king's happiness. In their welfare, his welfare. He shall not consider as good only that which pleases him, but treat as beneficial to him whatever pleases his subjects. Simply trying to say, king is not the ultimate. This is something that we need to understand. Perhaps the biggest problem that we find in political science and international relations is they're so overwhelmed with the Western theories, starting from the state to everything that have been spoken, including the idea of republic. And then subsequently, we have given up on the idea of the republic in the later stages. And the idea of the state comes in so strong, where the Western idea of the king or the monarchy, and then subsequently how they got rid of it, then the idea of democracy, state and its element somehow gets in or sits in so heavily. In the Indian context, the king was never the ultimate. It's only in the later stages when all these have been subjugated and there were distortions into the idea of how a kingdom is ruled or how a king has to behave. What is this Raja Dharma or Kshatriya Dharma? Different type of ideas behind it. Those things started changing in the much, much later stages. Otherwise, Kautilya's time, the king was never the ultimate. The king always was subject to certain given restrictions when he needed to follow the council, and he was not the ultimate, because he kept on telling throughout in Arthashastra, he talks about that the ultimate goal of the king is Prajasukam, that is happiness of the subject. Okay, and in that happiness, he has to find happiness. He cannot be living a lavish and an extraordinary life where his subjects are actually going through pathetic conditions. Okay, that is one of the reasons. Invariably, he brings the idea of dharma. One of the wrong things that have happened over a period of time with regard to Kautilya is that every other person claims to be an expert. And then there are umpteen number of quotes that have been attributed to Kautilya, which are not of Kautilya. He's also been given or branded as someone who's extremely cunning. He's also someone who gives you idea to get rid of people come what may. He also gives you an idea that you become a state or you become a strong person by whichever means that is possible. Certainly not. Dharma becomes the basis of everything. Now, dharma is also not a singular term, and it has certain sort of a definitive meaning. Now, dharma, when we say, it has several shades. That shade is also that the dharma of a king is different, dharma of a teacher is different, dharma of a subject is different, dharma of a soldier is different, dharma of an artist is different. So everybody has their own dharma. That's why when we open up dharma as an idea, you have Kula Dharma, you have Vritti Dharma, you have Mano Dharma, okay? Because all of these are molded under something called as the Swabhava. Swabhava is that there is something that is unique to each individual. That's where even if the king gives a ruling, if you find that's against Dharma, you can always deny it. That's the speciality. Unlike the Western concepts where universality is associated, that is not the case with regard to the Indian idea of dharma. Dharma, that's the reason most of the people tend to confuse with a lot of other things. One of the easiest thing that most of the people do when we say dharma is something that is associated with religion, right? That's one of the ways of looking at it. But there are umpteen number of ways of looking at it, because the perennial confusion of the dharma is always associated with the purusharthas. Okay, when we say purusharthas, they essentially are dharma, artha, kama, and moksha. Now, surprisingly, these need not be always something that is associated with one another. That means, can't we study dharma, artha, kama, moksha independently? It is. We can certainly do. Many a times I've also said before, to be a dharmic person or to understand what is dharma, there is no compulsion that you need to go through a particular way of learning and then learn dharma. If you know what is adharma, that means something that will not destroy dharma, that is more than enough. One of the simple examples I've always given to people is that to give alms to people or give rice to people is generally spoken in most of the places from the good perspective of dharma as dharma. But if you know that you need not snatch, or snatching the food from that individual is a sin, and you should not do. That itself is enough, because when you do an action that can take care and that would not allow you to go to adharma, dharma is taken care of. That is something that is very, very interesting component with regard to India. Now, everything that Kautilya has written, invariably he brings in and he says, dharma is the basis. Whatever we earn, whatever we do, there has to be a dharma that has to be qualified. And without that dharma, there is no possibility of it. Now, coming back to, now India calls itself proudly as a civilizational entity or a civilizational state. We have also heard quite a few professors, including Professor Lawrence Prabhakar. Many of the people have spoken about India as a civilizational state. Now, India and China both have stood time, and they've also been the most strongest one in terms of, though these religions that have been there in both the states have varied at a particular point of time. With regard to India, somehow, without the idea of conversion, without having gone to different places and brutalizing people and then converting them and all these things, somehow it has still continued to be one of the spectacular survivals in the history of humankind itself. Right? That's how, if we look at India as a civilizational state and look at certain components of the strategic thought, there where Kautilya comes as a very, very important personality. Now, to understand Kautilya, we are not supposed to look at Kautilya as someone who's preaching us. We are also not supposed to look at him from the perspective of a believer, but we need to look at him from the perspective of a seeker, because Indians were never believers. Believer, or the idea of belief, is largely associated with the Abrahamic religions. Indians are seekers. They keep seeking. There is nothing called an end. There is nothing called a saturation. That's why higher goals have always been given. So that difference between the believer and the seeker is very important to understand Kautilya, because he doesn't put anything as definitive and say, this is the end of it, nothing after this. For that matter, none of the texts would ever talk about saying that when this is the end of it, because it's a process of evolution. Okay. Another important component that we also look at is some sort of an ill-conceived notion that Kautilya has been compared with Machiavelli, Sun Tzu, Clausewitz, and all these people. At least one can understand if it's Sun Tzu. But Clausewitz and Machiavelli, they both have been mediocres, actually speaking. Machiavelli was thrown out, and then in desperation, he ended up writing something like that. Clausewitz could not stay with his own state. He had switched over to Russia, and he stayed with the Tsars, and then he begged pardon and he came back to the Germans, and then he fought for them, and his end was certainly not a great one. But stratagems were interesting. But comparing him or some of these individuals who wrote one minuscule component of what Kautilya has written doesn't actually do justice to the type of work that Kautilya has done. Okay, that is one of the problems that I see, because one component that comes in here is the idea that the Western scholars and Indian apologists both have actually pushed us so much to think low of our own civilizational writings and many other things, which makes several people to take refuge in the Western scholars and think that there is some sort of, it's much more fashionable to quote Plato or Aristotle than Kautilya, because the moment you quote Kautilya, they would start thinking, okay, here is a revivalist, or here is a revisionist probably, or he is someone who's still trying to settle score, or he is trying to look at a particular religion, or he's trying to look at a particular grouping, and there's some sort of a majoritarian idea that he's trying to push. There is no such compulsion, because Arthashastra can also be understood as a heuristic work or a psychoanalysis of Kautilya. He has understood the human mind much better than anybody else. That is the reason he was able to do some value addition, which we will not be able to see. So while looking at his work also, the ideas of state, sovereignty, many of these are colonial and the post-colonial constructs. So that is somehow has gone so deep into us, which we have not been able to come out. That is by Shama Shastri, which got published by early by 1909, and then 1915. If you look at one of the chapters, that is the book number 6, he calls it as the elements of the state and sovereignty. But the truth is that Kautilya doesn't even refer to a word called state, nor he refers to a word as sovereignty. It's called, the chapter's title in Sanskrit is Mandala Yonihi. Now, Mandala has different connotations. Mandala Yonihi nowhere translates it into state or sovereignty. But that's the sort of translation that came in because he was educated in Europe, and his idea was somewhere he had to fit Kautilya into the Western notion of the state, Western notion of sovereignty. Otherwise, he thought that work would not be relevant. It was only in the later stage, and not too later, somewhere around 1924, Ganapati Shastri worked with the Travancore kingdom, and then they published something that was completely in Sanskrit. Even the narration and the translation was also in Sanskrit, but subsequently picked up by Kangle, which is still continuing to be an authoritative work. And that gives us a different idea about how this whole work is done. So he has gone by the verse by verse. So that gives us a very good clarity because there is a flow. Apart from this, there are other numerous works that people have done. People have tried using from business management to everything that is possible. Nevertheless, we are not going to discuss any of those things. Now, the theory that we are talking about was fully developed by Kautilya, and also a full-fledged discussion is presented in the whole of Arthashastra. Now, all of us are aware there's 15 Adhikaranas. It's a book of Arthashastra, where 8 Adhikaranas, that is from the book 6 to books 13, are devoted by Kautilya for providing some sort of an elaborated discussions on the constituents. That's the anga of the ideal state that he talks about, or ideal entity, because again the word state would confuse us. So, but I would interchangeably use because we have already got used to it. So, ideal entity, then the Rajamandala of the kings. That means the concentric circles that we look at. Where he also pushes the idea of the 6 elements of the foreign policy that we look at. Foreign policy, we need not always imagine of the present day India and then its application elsewhere. Those times there were kingdoms, and then one kingdom interacting with the other kingdom was also called as a foreign policy. There where he brings in the 6 elements which are called as the Shadgunya, and then preparations for the war, various kinds of the troops mobilized, then appropriate time for launching a campaign. So he talks about Prakriti, that is the nature or the fog of war, many other things that we look at in the later stages also, which is very, very interesting, in fact, because Prakriti is something that you will find even in Sun Tzu. You will find it in this thing, what is it, Clausewitz also. Clausewitz also heavily talks about the fog of war. Means he says, however great is your army, you might be the best prepared, but nature can have its own say and it can destroy. Now, there were also people who doubted comparatively authorship of the Arthashastra, whether it was Chanakya or not. But invariably, whether you look at Panchatantra, you look at Dandi, or you look at Bhanabhatta's work, in all these places, they invariably talk about it, and that's a confirmation that we get. Like one of the works that I can cite is from the Panchatantra, where it says, Tato Dharma Shastrani Manvadini, Artha Shastrani Chanakyadini, Kama Shastrani Vatsayanadini. So in that, he simply says this, there is Artha Shastra, there is Dharma Shastra, that is Manu and others have already taken care of. You have Artha Shastra that's written by Chanakya, and then you have Vatsayana's Kama Shastra. So it simply says so, Dharma Shastra, Artha Shastra, Kama Shastra, because you also have to understand Dharma, Artha, Kama, Moksha. That's how we look at the whole idea itself. So 3 very, very important elements. If those 3 can be taken care of, the Dharma, Artha and Kama, Moksha is something that you naturally end up with, because that is in the outer world. Moksha is not in the physical world. So all these 3 are taken care of. Where else you will find such comprehensive work in any text of the world, for that matter? That's the comprehensiveness that you would find in Kautilya's Arthashastra. Now, in Bhanabhatta and Dandi, I was telling you, in Dandi he says, Adishvatavad Dandadanim iyam idamacharyan Vishnuguptena Maurete Shabdihi Shloka Sahasraihi Sankshipta. He says about 6,000 slokas that were written about by Vishnugupta. Vishnugupta is another name to Chanakya himself. That's how he talks about each of those components. So in the initial stage, about the strategic thought, he brings in several other people. He gives his salutations to lot of people who have written Arthashastras before him. And then he says he has tried coming up with something that was relevant, that was timely, that was required for him also. We need to also understand the context in which he was humiliated. There was something that he had to come up with. He had to save the republic that was already there. And that was an important task that was in front of him. That is how he starts writing each of those components. So by the time we come to the book 6, there where you find what we have codified today as Saptanga. But nowhere in Kautilya's Arthashastra you would ever find a word also called as Saptanga. Okay, these are 7 elements, the Prakritihi that he talks about, which we have called as Saptanga. Okay, otherwise there is no word called Saptanga in the Kautilya's Arthashastra itself. So, Swami Mamatya Janapada Durga Kosha Dandamitrani Prakrityaha. This is what he says in book 6, verse number 1, and then the shloka number 1, and then the next point is point 1. So 1.16, 1.1 is where he talks about. So he mentions this whole thing, the 7 things that or elements that we are talking about. Swami Amatya Janapada Durga Kosha Danda Mitrani Prakrityaha. He talks about like that. Now, when we look at each of those components, we will understand the Swami is supposed to, and these are some sort of a, it's a circle because each one is dependent on the other. Now, the Swami, that means the leader of the state, cannot operate by himself. He certainly requires a set of people because he himself has to do everything. He cannot be there everywhere. And it's also beyond human capacity. So he needs to have a council. That is how he will have the Amatyas. Amatyas are the council who will rightly guide the leader, because the leader need not be or will not be in a position to guide on everyone and everything. So here where the Amatyas come and guide him at times when it is required, and they will also be learned scholars. So he mentions qualities of who is supposed to be a Swami, that means the leader, who is supposed to be an Amatya, a set of people or the councils, and then he goes into Janapada. Now, just take the backward. Now, Janapada is about the human resource, is about the type of people you have. There's no meaning in having a crowd which is not worth. There is no necessity to have a human resource which cannot contribute to the welfare of a particular entity or a kingdom or a state, for that matter, in the modern terminology. If you have a good population, from that good population only you can have the Amatyas, the set of councillors. Among the set of councillors, somebody who is extraordinary or who possesses those qualities will only become a Swami. Right? It's very natural. We see somebody serving as part of the Council of Ministers for some time and then subsequently becoming a Prime Minister. So here we have all sorts of examples across the world where somebody directly comes in and also occupies such position. But Kautilya's Arthashastra very clearly says the person is expected to have certain qualities. Only when the individual have those qualities, then he can come in. So after Janapada, he goes into Durga. Durga essentially means the fortification. So fortification, he gives such details of even trenches, what level of trenches, what size it has to be. He goes into each of those details. Everything is detailed, written in Arthashastra. And after Durga, something that he very interestingly does is he goes into economy, that is kosha. He says without the kosha, without that component of economy, you cannot sustain. Here where somewhere I find the Chinese using that particular model, or for that matter, Deng Xiaoping using that model, where he thought first, let's economically become very strong and then subsequently look at your physical strength. That means the military strength, right? Here, Chanakya very clearly talks about, or Kautilya says that after Janapada, Durga, he doesn't bring Danda. He brings kosha. After kosha, only when you have money, enough money, then you can. Otherwise, I've said this before too, that you will eat grass and make bomb. That becomes very, very problematic. That pushes people into criticizing the state itself, saying you no more are a welfare state. You're not interested about it. You've been buying weapons. You've been spending millions and millions of money, and our people are starving. Do we mean to say that till the last man is fed or the last individual is fed, the state would not take care of its security? Even that is not the condition, but it need not be in extremes. So it needs to be balanced. So he thinks only when you have economic prosperity, then the idea of Danda, so you can feed them. Because he further explains each of these problems. How if you don't take care of the kosha, the danda can end up becoming problem to you. One day they will rebel against you and they may end up killing the king himself. They may end up killing the amatya also, which is all a possibility. That's how the coups have happened across the world in different junctures. And then the biggest contribution of Kautilya is the idea of mitra, because that's the modern terminology of ally. Otherwise, Swami, Amatya, Janapada, Durga, Kosha, and Danda, because there is a whole writing on Danda Niti itself. Okay, till Danda, even the previous Arthashastras have spoken. Arthashastras have written. After Kautilya also, you have Kamandakiya Nitisara, where Kamandaka also has written about it. He has even expanded certain components of it. Mitra is an unique addition that Kautilya has done. Here where he looks at allies, he talks about, he gives different scenarios. He gives a scenario at a point of time. Do you wish to have a friend who's strong and who doesn't intervene when you are actually in trouble? Or do you look at someone who's weak but who's ready to help you at a particular point? I mean, he gives you the modern day, what we call as scenario building. He gives you all sorts of game theories where you do different type of permutation and combinations, where you keep looking at, okay, if this and this combination happens, what will be the outcome? Do you want such type of a mitra to be with you? How do you choose an ally? Who is a trustworthy ally? All these things he talks about. And then he says, Danda mitrani prakritya. He talks about these as elements. And he says, without keeping or without giving enough understanding on these elements, it can be very, very problematic. Because he says the state can exist and function properly only if all the limbs of its body, politic, become mutually integrated and cooperate with each other. That's where he simply says, Atmavam Atma Atmalapadeshu Yuktaha Prakriti Sampadaha Nayagnaha Prithvim Krishtanam Jayateva na Hiyate. He talks about this in book 6 again, where he's talking about the elements in 18th shloka. He mentions this one, essentially trying to say that the functions of the body can happen only when all the limbs, what he's talking about, the 7 elements that he's trying to put it. Now, he further talks about, as I said, about the importance of economy, because he's also read as one of the greatest economists. So he says, Kosha mulo hi dandaha, kosha bhave dandaha, param gacchati, swaminam va ahanti, sarvabhi yoga karaschat, kosho dharma kama hetuhu. He says the means, the army indeed is rooted in the treasury. In the absence of a treasury, the army goes over the enemy or kills the king. He's warning here. One, they'll go to get the spoils of the war by trying to attack the enemy and then become brutal. At the same time, they can also, if that does not work or they go crazy when there is not enough money in the treasury, they can also turn against the king. This is what they're trying to say. Because the treasury, ensuring the success of all endeavors, is the means of observing virtuous acts and of enjoying desire. That's why spoils of the war, unlike the Abrahamic traditions, unlike many other places, there exists some sort of an understanding that it has to be formally, it has to be just fully distributed among all the people. Okay, because the Dharma Sutras somewhere give the impression that normally, okay, if we look at the way the army is kept, because Chanakya at times is also called, same like Manu, he's also talking about caste system. He was also not ready to shake up everything and all sorts of accusations. But if we go a little more deeper, go to the 9th book of Kautilya, you will see, though he also subscribed to the idea that the Kshatriyas are the one by Dharma, they are supposed to be part of it. But subsequently, he also says that the Vaishyas and the Shudra, on account of numerical strength, they can also be part of the army. This is where Kautilya is much more enabling, because he doesn't get struck with the idea of only the caste, but he also doesn't do revolutionary things to shake it up, because that's how the things worked at that particular point in time. Okay, because it is very clearly written in the Dharma Sutras that it's the Kshatriyas, and in emergency only the Brahmanas and the Vaishyas could take up arms. But nowhere you will see the Shudras being mentioned. But here is a case, classic case, where he very clearly says there is a possibility that they can come in, because it is supposed to be composed purely of the Kshatriyas of noble birth, strong-bodied, trained in the art of using weapons, and well-disciplined, might be called the best army. But then he says, you can even go further. Apart from the Kshatriyas, you can also have the Vaishyas and the Shudras in your troop in the army. This is what he talks about in the 9th book, in chapter 2, verse number 24. He speaks about this one. Praharana Vaidya Vivanametu Kshatriya Balam Shreyaha Bahulasaram Vaishya Sudra Balamiti. He says that with the sheer numerical number that we have, at times and when there is a necessity, if the state or if the entity deems that it fits in, there is all possibility that they can get in here. Now, in the whole idea of the concept of his entity or his kingdom, he brings in the king as Vijigishu. Now, Vijigishu need not be his king alone, anybody who wants to be a conqueror. So, for him, he gives 4 important upayas. Upayas are expedients. When he says 4 upayas, he talks about Sama, Dana, Veda, and Danda. He talks about. So, here also, see, everybody tries to confuse people or young scholars by telling that Kautilya always said that kill your enemy before the enemy is even thinking about it. Okay. At times, in a context, he has said certain things in that way, but it does not anyway mean that he always wanted violence. He knew the cost of war. He knew the amount of money that would be spent and the cost of rising an army, the human resource that is involved. Right? So he never was that sort of a bellicose or that sort of a person who would simply say, let's go just destroy everyone. Let's keep on killing. Let's acquire more and more land. Certainly it wasn't. That is not something that you will see. That's why in the upayas or the 4 expedients that he gives, he talks about Sama. That is peaceful negotiation first. He says, first try out that. Second, he says about the gift. Okay, in which he talks also about the Veda, means in the Sama itself, he says you can give gifts, you can, in the modern terminologies, you can understand giving them loans, giving them different other type of things that are required by those states, and then you can still manage them. You can have peaceful negotiation. There is no compulsion that you always have to fight. Second is Vedha, where you sow the seeds of dissension among various organs of the administration. He says the best war is the one which you win without shedding blood. That essentially means that you need to know the art of winning the war even before the war begins. That means you need to know how to bring dissent among the people of your adversary, and then make sure that they get weakened, and then you use your espionage, you use your agents who are all of different qualities, and then you get it. He, in fact, at a point of time talks about like our diplomats. He says that they should be there and they should belong to a particular category which others should not even come to know. He talks about widows. He talks about several people who fit into what type of intelligence. There is a whole lot of story with regard to the idea of espionage itself in Kautilya, which probably we can do some other time. Then he says, when that doesn't work, right? Sama, Dana is where you give gifts. Dana is also where you tend to extend lot of support and other things. Then you go to Veda, where you put dissent. Then finally, when it does not work at all, then you resort to war. Okay? Because that should be the last one that he talks about. Because as I was mentioning to Kamandaki or Kamandaka, adds 3 more to that one, into the above stratagems. He says Maya, Upeksha, and Indrajala. Okay, Indrajala is essentially something that sounds like magic, but he gives different connotations to that one. And while following this, as the instruments of diplomacy and strategy, he talks about Shadgunya, where he talks about Sandhi, Vigraha, Yana, Asana, Vaidhi Bhava, and Samsharya. He talks about these as instruments of diplomacy and strategy, where you negotiate with them, then you try preparing yourself. He always says, while you are negotiating also, you need to have certain preparations, because the element of surprise that the enemy wants to have on you can be very problematic. Okay, because even under each of these, like under Sandhi, under Vigraha, Yana, Asana, Dvaiti Bhava, and Samsarya, there are further elements. That's the level of intricate details that Kautilya goes into. One of the simple things that I can give in the Shadgunyas is Asana. Within Asana, he talks about 10 kinds of different asanas, where he says Swasthana, where he says that you stay back in the place that you are supposed to. Don't move from the headquarters. He says stay there, Swasthana. Then he says Upeksha. Upeksha is have indifference to. That means stop responding to what is being pushed from the other side. Don't respond. Like we are aware of how certain nations have been trying to push data and other things on India so that India gets intimidated and starts talking about it. And India has become indifferent to many of those things. That's how it has to remain at some point of time, because otherwise your adversaries, enemies exactly expect you to behave at that particular point of time that way, because in the fit of rage, when you take decisions, your rationality goes. And that's exactly what your adversaries want you to do. Then Margaroda, that is blocking canals and channels. This is something that we have seen when the India-Pakistan conflict rose to a particular heated level. We were talking about cutting off the water connectivity and other things. We were also talking about really looking at the Indus water treaty, many other things. This is a normal thing that you will see. Even the Romans used to do this one to the neighbors, and subsequently to save the Republic. They ended up doing it to the Greeks, many other people. So cutting off or blocking the canals and channels is something that they would very normally do. This is something that's been observed. Then Durga Sadhya, he says possession of the fort. That means you need to conquer, and you also have to take care of your own fort. Okay. Then Rashtra Vikarana, then he talks about bringing the enemy under control. Rashtra Vikarana is that sow the seeds in such a way that it creates confusion. This is something that India is accused of what it keeps doing with regard to Nepal, but it's something that he talks about. He very clearly says there is a necessity. You need to have all elements of it. If you completely remain novice and you try becoming the leader of peace all over the world, certainly you are not going to be surviving. That's what he talks about. Then he says Ramaniya, to maintain most pleasantly. That means have and some of these people, you have the Udasina, you also have the Madhyama who come in actually in the discussion of the Rajamandala. And there where he talks about, to such people you need to be extremely pleasant. In our context, when the United States president comes in, or the Chinese one, let's say United States supposed to be the most powerful or the sole superpower at this juncture. So to them, how you behave is very, very important. And the way you behave to someone or a country like Canada, because we showed what we are capable of. We sent an agriculture minister to the airport to receive him, right? But at the same time, you will see a prime minister breaking the protocol and he himself going to the airport and doing a lot of things to a lot of people. This is also there. So to maintain that post pleasantly, or Ramaniya is also one of the instruments that he talks about. Nikatasana, he talks about another terminology, which is defeating the enemy at a place near his own. That means you don't even allow him to come out. That is what you need to do. Then he talks about Durmarga. Durmarga is selecting the choicest sites and owning them. You need to own that place. You need to know that place so well. Only after that one, you need to go for an expedition. Till then, you should not go. Okay. Then he talks about Pralopasana. That means stabilizing the power in the conquered country. Because until and unless those citizens or those subjects accept you as a conqueror, there is always this danger that they can end up becoming enemies to you, and then that enmity can actually destroy your state. So he says that is also very important. That is called as the Pralopasana. And then he talks about Paradhina. That means by taking refuge with a superior king. Here where he says not every time the conqueror or the Vijigishu can be in the same position. At times when you have greater ones coming into you, because the whole idea of the statecraft or politics itself is hierarchical, in which you will always have someone somewhere else being extremely powerful. You might be internally very powerful in your own nation. Let's imagine something that happened like the Mongols came in, right? Genghis Khan came in. Then you had to actually take refuge with somebody else who was much more powerful. That's what many of them did. Many of them who did not understand this idea actually also failed. So he says Paradhina is also important, because the king who observed the state of asana, or generally the possessed with 3 Shaktis, because always the state has to understand 3 important Shaktis that he possesses at any given point of time. One is Prabhu Shakti, Utsaha Shakti, or Mantra Shakti. Prabhu and Prabhava, they're interchangeably used. It is here where that you will see how a Swamin has to lead from the front. So you have the Prabhu or Prabhava Shakti, that's your sphere of influence that we talk in the modern terminology. You have the Utsaha Shakti, where you individually lead from the front. It is you who makes the statement and who lead from the front. And then you have the Mantra Shakti, which is equivalent of what in the modern terminology we are talking about at the soft part. So all the components that have been put out by people in modern terms have all been taken care of, right? That's where it comes in, because these extraordinary understandings are part of his whole idea. Whatever we are talking about, whether we are talking about war, diplomacy, or trying to negotiate with someone, the Prakriti or the Saptanga that we are talking about, or Rajamandala, everything is at the end of the day is for the Yogakshema. This is a very important word that Kautilya uses throughout. If there is no Yogakshema, or the happiness of the welfare of the people, there is no necessity for the king to survive, or there is no other job to the king other than the Yogakshema of the people, is something that he talks about. This is something that I thought some of those components we need to bring in and look at the relevance in a world more than that a stone with regard to war and what is a fights. He's useful in the peaceful world too. It's not that every time he needs to be invoked only when we are doing something cunning or when we are attacking someone. He is much more useful during the peacetime. He is also giving you different ideas that how you can actually utilize him in a different point of time. Now, throughout Kautilya's work, he refers to, as I told you, more than 23, 24 scholars. He gives us some sort of a message that one should have all the liberty to criticize and write a rejoinder. This is something that even in the academics we can improvise, okay? Because there is an exemplary perspective from Kautilya which brings more dignity and respect to the academic community itself, because he wrote this in a Sanskrit that is comparatively different than what is being taught today and the one which is being used today. But nevertheless, at the same time, it gives us more reasons to read him now, because there is some sort of a revival, and that revival is not to push down or pull down somebody who's already there. It's just about celebration of something that's been there with us. So it has given us a chance, and it's been just streamlined to look at some of these works, because these are gems. As I mentioned to you, there are numerous works that are not with us. Many of the Arthashastras are not with us. Many of the Niti Saras are not with us. But at the same time, it is something that we can restore, we can keep, and the modern day the leader whom we call in the Saptanga or in the Prakriti, we look at someone like Swamin can actually utilize for the Yogakshema of the people. Probably with that, I'll stop here, and if we have questions, I'll probably I'll be more than happy to take the questions. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, sir, for that wonderful exposition of Kautilya's Arthashastra, and also linking it to India's strategic thought and its relevance in the 21st century. So that was a wonderful talk. Now I would like to invite our guests and students and other Manipalites from other constituents of Mahe to ask their questions. If they have any questions, please raise them.
Dr. Nandakishore, it was a wonderful presentation. I appreciate myself, Dr. Shripati Adiga from Ayurveda department. We were knowing Kautilya from Ayurvedic angle, and you have given a wide perspective with respect to the how to build the nation. Thanks for that. It was a wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor Adiga. Does anybody else have any question at this point? Students, anybody, please if you have any questions. I don't see any questions in the comment section, so.
Dheeraj is there. Dheeraj?
Yeah, I see him online.
He should ask some question. He has been working on the intelligence issues.
Okay. Okay. Did I hear someone?
No.
Just
Go ahead.
No. Okay. I don't see anyone having any question here. But yes, you are most welcome to address any issues you have or anything related to Kautilya's Arthashastra or otherwise to Professor to Dr. Nandkishore at any point in time. So maybe this is okay. No, I thought somebody raised their hand. No, nobody has raised their hand. So we can stop here with this session. I would like to now invite Dr. Ravindranathan P, Assistant Professor Senior Scale at the Department of Geopolitics and International Relations, to deliver the vote of thanks. Okay. Wait. Okay. Now let me just invite Dheeraj. Finally, he raised his hand. So if he has any question, please. Dheeraj, you will have to unmute yourself.
Text him and say that he needs to unmute. He may not be able to listen.
Yeah. Okay. I can't see. Okay. I'm not able to reach him. I don't know if he can unmute himself and. I don't see. Yeah.
I can see he has raised his hand.
Yeah, he has
Texted
to unmute himself.
I've texted him. Hope he sees.
Okay. Yeah.
Dheeraj,
Dheeraj, are you there?
are you able to hear us? Dheeraj?
I think Dheeraj has said here that he has unmuted himself, but here it is shown that he is still in mute mode.
Yeah, he is still mute mode according to this. I don't know.
Just 1 minute.